So here's an interesting bit of news reported by Rick Hutzel earlier this week in the opinion section of the Baltimore Banner. Headline: If Trump wins, the right-wing thought police will come for the Naval Academy. And the story has to do with a woman named Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who was recently invited and then disinvited from giving an address at the United States Naval Academy, which is located in the city of Annapolis, right here in my very own home state of Maryland. And you might be asking yourself, who is Ruth Ben-Ghiat? Well, quoting from the article, she's a New York University historian with a book on what happens to the military when authoritarians take power. She shows up as a commentator on MSNBC, connecting former President Donald Trump to some of the dictators she's studied. The Academy's History Department invited her to speak about her work at the annual Bancroft Memorial Lecture. Then, she was disinvited. Her politics were the problem, not her lecture. In addition to her academic work and teaching at the university, Ruth Ben-Ghiat writes a newsletter in which she discusses contemporary politics and describes how Donald Trump exhibits similarities to some of the historical dictators that she studies and writes about and teaches about. The day that she announced her then upcoming lecture at the Naval Academy, she had published a piece in her newsletter titled "The Real Reason Donald Trump Insults the U.S. Military." And this, and her general sort of stance of being critical of Donald Trump, was ostensibly the reason why right-wing lobbying groups led by the Heritage Foundation, which you probably know is the organization responsible for Project 2025, began to pressure the Naval Academy to cancel Ben-Ghiat's invitation to give this lecture. The Heritage Foundation was joined in this effort by several other right-wing lobbying groups and also several Republican members of the United States Congress. Quoting from further on in the article, Republicans on the House Armed Services Committee wrote Naval Academy Superintendent Vice Admiral Yvette Davids and called for an explanation. Signers included 2 Naval Academy graduates, U.S. Representative Mike Garcia of California, class of 1998, and U.S. Representative Nick Lalata of New York, class of 2000, plus U.S. Representative Jen Kiggins of Virginia, a former Navy helicopter pilot whose son attended Annapolis. What steps will the USNA take to ensure that future speakers at the Bancroft Lecture Series reflect the Academy's commitment to impartiality and intellectual rigor, particularly on politically sensitive topics? They wrote. At this point, you might be asking yourself, what was the politically sensitive topic of Ruth Ben-Ghiat's scheduled lecture? What was the topic that was so politically charged that so many right-wingers demanded that the Naval Academy cancel her speech? According to the flyer advertising the event, the subject of the speech was to be militaries and authoritarian regimes, coups, corruption, and the costs of losing democracy. Obviously, the fact that Ruth Ben-Ghiat has been critical of Donald Trump was a major motivation behind all of these Republicans pissing and moaning and contacting the Naval Academy and demanding that they cancel this lecture. But Ben-Ghiat herself, who I remind you is a respected historian at a major university whose academic work is nonpartisan, she summarized the lecture she had planned to give in an email to the writer of this piece I've been quoting from, Rick Hutzel, and she described the lecture she had intended to give at the Naval Academy like this. The lecture had nothing to do with contemporary America, and I was not going to mention Mr. Trump at all in this strictly nonpartisan event at an institution, the U.S. Naval Academy, which I greatly admire. Why in the world, by the way, do you like that move, taking the glasses off? Makes me seem more intellectual and studious. I've just been reading with my glasses, and now it's time to remove them as I make a comment. Anyway, why in the world would a bunch of Republicans have a problem with a professional historian giving a lecture at the Naval Academy about how militaries function under authoritarian rule the month before a presidential election where the Republican nominee is Donald Trump. I just can't figure it out. What could it be? Here's a better question. Whatever happened to academic freedom? Remember several years ago, the deplatforming controversies that kicked up mostly online in response to right-wing personalities being disinvited from speaking at universities, mostly here in the United States and in the United Kingdom, following student protests, or as was also happening at roughly the same time when right-wing trolls like Milo Yiannopoulos were being banned from Twitter and Facebook and other social media sites. Remember how mad all the right-wingers were about that back then? Because when it happens to them, completely unacceptable, isn't it? When it happens to them, it's a shameful infringement on academic freedom. It's a violation of the right to free speech. It's tyranny. All voices have a right to be heard. The university or the social media site, whatever the case may be, should be a place where people are exposed to a diversity of viewpoints and a place where ideas, even controversial ideas, even unpopular ideas, are heard and debated, not silenced. That's when it happens to them. But at a time like this, when a historian is invited to address the Naval Academy on a topic that hits a little too close to home for Trump supporters, how militaries function under authoritarian regimes, a little close to the bone for you guys, huh? At times like this, freedom of speech? Viewpoint diversity? What's that? They can't call for her to be deplatformed fast enough. The hypocrisy on display, while not the least bit surprising, is still impressive in its utter shamelessness. These people live by a double standard, and the longer Trump's reign at the top of the Republican Party continues, the less they care if everybody knows it. They live openly by a double standard. There is one set of rules for their side, and there is another set of rules for everyone who they perceive to be an enemy. And their set of rules says they get to do whatever they want. But more important than the hypocrisy is the message that this kind of behavior sends, and the reminder that it should be to all of us. And that reminder is, when people like this are in power, this is what they will do. We should take this as a preview of what we can expect under a second Trump administration. If Trump wins this election, and especially if Republicans are able to increase their political power in Congress and in state legislatures and in the courts across this country, this is how they will govern. And this is how they will treat the opposition. Dissent will be silenced. Any idea, any person expressing any idea to the left of their aggressively right-wing agenda will be labeled a Marxist or a communist or a radical leftist, the enemy within, and be treated accordingly. And the thing you must remember is it's not me saying this, and it's not the Kamala Harris for President campaign saying this, and it's not the Democratic Party saying this. It's the Heritage Foundation. It's Republicans in Congress. It's the Trump campaign, although the Trump campaign itself doesn't appear to have been directly involved with the disinviting of Ruth Ben-Ghiat from the Naval Academy, but I'm sure they didn't mind. They are telling us themselves from their own mouths, loud and clear, over and over again, what they intend to do if we allow them to take the power necessary to do it. These aren't reasonable people trying to moderate these public spaces or these intellectual or academic spaces in a responsible way. These aren't responsible people trying to block extremists from spreading their message. These people are the extremists, and they are trying to seize power. And the prospect of that is scary. The possibility of that happening, or happening to a greater degree than it has already happened, should scare you. But in addition to scaring you, it should do more than that. It needs to do more than that. It needs to motivate you to do something. Defending our institutions, our political institutions, our educational institutions, our military from right-wing extremism is vital to the survival of this country, is vital to the survival of democracy in this country. And doing that, protecting all those institutions from right-wing extremism, requires more of us than just voting in elections. But it's impossible to accomplish that protection without winning elections and depriving extremists like those who support Donald Trump of the political power they need to enact their agenda. So if you are eligible and you haven't already done so, please vote in this election. Vote on Election Day on November 5th. Vote early. Vote by mail if those are options available to you. Whatever works best for you. Make a plan and vote in this election. And don't just vote for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, although definitely vote for them for president and vice president, but vote for Democrats all the way down the ballot for Congress, for U.S. Senate, if you have a senator in your state who is up for election, for your state and your local offices, top to bottom, Democrats all the way, because Republicans have spent decades consolidating their power in this country at all levels, federal, state, local, and they have used that power and will continue to use that power to impose their regressive, intolerant agenda on all of us. And the only reason they've been able to do it as much as they have up to this point is because too many of us have been AWOL in this fight. It's been a slogan for the Harris campaign throughout this election season, and it's a good slogan because it's true. When we meaning progressives, we meaning people who are opposed to Trump and his supporters and what they stand for and what they want to inflict on this country, when we show up, we win. When we fight, we win. This time, every time, but especially this time. We all need to show up, whether you live in a blue state or a red state or a purple state. We all need to show up and vote Democrat all the way down the ballot, because if we don't, and if we don't stop Donald Trump and his supporters, historians being disinvited from lecturing at the Naval Academy is going to be the least of our worries.